There's a specific kind of tired that doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from finally stopping. You sit down, or you lie on the bed, or you take your shoes off, and you feel your body drop into the moment for the first time all day. And then the guilt arrives. Not loud guilt, not dramatic guilt, a quiet pressure. A feeling that says, you shouldn't be here. Like rest is something you have to earn. Like comfort is something you can only touch if you've proven you deserve it first. And what makes it confusing is that you're not resting because life is easy. You're resting because you are exhausted, because your eyes feel heavy, because your mind feels overused, because your body has been carrying the day. And still, the moment you stop, something inside you starts searching for a reason to stand back up. You may not even call it guilt at first. Sometimes it feels like restlessness. Sometimes it feels like irritation. Sometimes it feels like a need to just do one more thing. You get up to check something small. You pick up your phone. You open an app. You start cleaning a corner of the room. You answer a message you could have answered later. You create movement, not because you suddenly found energy, but because being still feels wrong. And the strange part is, you can be alone in your room with nothing urgent happening, and your mind will still act like you're being watched, as if someone is going to walk in and judge you for resting, as if stillness needs an explanation, as if peace has to be defended. Some people feel this most on weekends. You wake up on a day you should be able to breathe, and instead of feeling relief, you feel pressure. You feel behind. You feel like you are wasting time. You feel like the day is slipping away and you haven't done enough to deserve it. So even your rest day becomes a day of proving. You do a few tasks so you can justify sitting down. You run errands so you can feel less guilty. You try to clear your conscience before you allow yourself to relax. And if you do rest, you don't fully rest. Your body is on the couch, but your mind is still working, counting, measuring, evaluating. You rest with one eye open inside your own thoughts. Some people feel it after work. You come home, you finally have a moment, and your body wants to shut down, but your mind starts listing what you didn't do, what you forgot, what you should have said, what you should have done better, what you should prepare tomorrow. It becomes hard to simply exist. Even when nothing is happening, your mind keeps creating a reason to stay tense. Some people feel it when they're sick. You're clearly not okay, your body's asking for recovery, but the guilt still shows up. You're being lazy, you're being weak, you're falling behind, you're going to regret resting. And you start bargaining with yourself. You try to rest while still staying productive. You answer emails from bed. You keep up appearances. You force yourself to function so you don't feel like a problem. You try to be ill in a way that is still acceptable. And if you've lived this long enough, you start to believe this is just your personality. You might tell people you're hard on yourself. You might say you can't relax. You might laugh and call yourself a workaholic. But under that label, there is often something more precise happening. Your system does not interpret rest as neutral. It interprets rest as risky. Because rest creates space, and space brings you face to face with something you've been outrunning, your own needs. And for a lot of people, needs were never treated as simple. Needs were treated as inconvenient, or expensive, or selfish, or dangerous. So you learned early, maybe without anyone ever saying it clearly, that being low need was safer, that being useful was safer, that being easy was safer. And if you are someone who learned to be useful early in life, this guilt makes sense. It's not random. It's an internal rule you've been living under for a long time. A rule that says, if I'm not producing something, I'm not allowed to relax. A rule that says, if I stop, I might fall apart. A rule that says, if I rest, I'm being irresponsible. And even if your current life is different now, the rule can still be active. Because the mind doesn't update rules just because time passed. It updates rules when it feels safe enough to. And this is where the story is usually misunderstood. People think the guilt is proof that you need more discipline, or proof that you're lazy and need to push, or proof that you don't want success badly enough. But often, guilt for resting is not about ambition, it's about safety. At some point, staying active protected something. It protected your place. It protected your image. It protected your relationships. It protected your worth in the room. Maybe you grew up in a home where rest was criticized, where sitting down was treated like a problem, where you were called lazy even when you were tired, where love felt connected to effort. Maybe you grew up around stress, where people were always rushing, always tense, always trying to survive the next bill, the next issue, the next argument. In that home, rest doesn't look like peace. Rest looks like neglect. Rest looks like danger. So you learn to stay awake even when nothing is happening. Maybe you grew up in a place where moods could change quickly, where a calm moment could turn into conflict, where you learned to read the room, where you learned to stay alert, to keep things stable. In that environment, rest can feel like dropping your guard. And you don't drop your guard if you learn that surprise cost you. Maybe you weren't praised for being a person. Maybe you were praised for being reliable, for being strong, for being mature for your age, for not complaining, for handling things, for helping. And when you get rewarded for being low need and dependable, your mind starts to attach your value to that role. So later, when you try to rest, the guilt isn't just about the task, it's about identity. If you stop doing, who are you? If you stop helping, what are you worth? If you stop being strong, what happens? For some people, it's not even childhood, it's adulthood. Maybe you entered a season where you had to work hard to stay afloat. You had responsibilities that didn't give you room. You had pressure that didn't pause. You had people depending on you. And you learned a new version of the same rule. If I relax, things will collapse. So your mind stayed on. It stayed ready. It became an internal manager. And even when the danger reduces later, the manager doesn't retire. It keeps pacing. It keeps checking. It keeps reminding you. It keeps producing guilt as a way to keep you moving. Because guilt is a powerful fuel. It doesn't feel good, but it works. It gets you up. It gets you to do things. It gets you to prove. And that's why guilt becomes a habit. Not because you like it, because it kept you functioning. But here is the quiet cost. When guilt is the fuel, rest never becomes nourishment. Rest becomes a negotiation. Rest becomes something you do while secretly punishing yourself. Rest becomes a thing you allow only after you have done enough. And the problem is, enough is a moving target. Because guilt doesn't have an endpoint. If guilt is your inner driver, it will always find another reason. You could do more. You should do more. Other people are doing more. You're behind. You're wasting time. So even when you achieve something, guilt doesn't leave you. It just changes shape. And over time, this becomes a life where you are functioning but not resting. You are performing but not recovering. You are surviving but not living. You can be productive and still feel empty. You can be dependable and still feel drained. You can be admired and still feel like you're not allowed to stop. And this is where people start to lose something important without noticing it right away. They lose their ability to enjoy. They lose their softness. They lose their natural rhythm. They start treating themselves like a machine that must always justify its existence. They only feel good enough when they are tired from effort. They only feel clean inside when they have paid a cost. And when a person lives this way long enough, even peace can feel uncomfortable. Because peace feels unfamiliar. It feels undeserved. It feels suspicious. And that's not because you're broken. It's because your nervous system learned a different language. A language where movement equals safety. A language where rest equals vulnerability. So it makes sense that when you rest, your system gets tense. It thinks you are doing something risky. It thinks you are about to be judged. It thinks you are about to lose something. And the guilt is its way of pulling you back into motion. This is the moment where a small shift can happen. Not a motivational shift, not a new habit shift, not a try harder shift. A position shift, a different way of standing inside the experience. Because guilt is not always a moral signal. Sometimes guilt is simply an old alarm. Sometimes guilt is the echo of a past environment. Sometimes guilt is your mind using an old tool for a new moment. And if you start to treat guilt as an alarm instead of a verdict, the ground changes. The guilt can still appear, but you don't have to obey it immediately. You can notice it. You can recognize it. You can see what it's trying to do. Because guilt often speaks like it has authority. It has that tone. It sounds like truth. It sounds like responsibility. It sounds like maturity. But an alarm also sounds urgent, and it isn't always accurate. An alarm is designed to react quickly, not to reflect wisely. So when guilt shows up during rest, you can begin to see the pattern. My system is trying to get me back into proving. My mind is trying to keep me in motion. This is that old rule again. And the more you see it, the less mysterious it becomes. You don't have to fight it. You don't have to argue with it. You don't have to win against it. Because fighting it can make it louder. It can turn it into a debate that keeps your mind active. And what you actually need in rest is not another debate. You need space. You need permission without a courtroom. You need quiet without self-cross-examination. So the shift is smaller than people expect. It's not, I will never feel guilt again. It's, I can feel guilt and still rest. I can hear the alarm and not treat it as a command. I can let my body recover while my mind complains. That's a different kind of strength. Not a loud strength, a calm strength, a mature strength, because it doesn't depend on force. It depends on clarity. And clarity is often what people have been missing. They've been living under guilt so long, they forgot to ask what it's actually protecting. Guilt for resting often protects an identity that kept you safe. The identity of being the one who handles it, the one who doesn't need much, the one who stays useful, the one who earns their place. And I want to say this carefully. Being useful is not bad. Being responsible is not bad. Being dependable is not bad. But when your worth is chained to those things, rest starts to feel like a threat. Because rest looks like the opposite of your identity. And if your identity was built to keep you loved, respected, safe, needed, then rest can feel like stepping out of the role that gave you protection. So it makes sense that your system resists it. It's not stubbornness, it's loyalty. Loyalty to the version of you that survived. The version of you that learned don't relax too early. The version of you that learned earn your peace. The version of you that learned if I stop, I'll be judged. And there is something quietly emotional here, even if no tears come with it. Because when a person cannot rest, it usually means they have been carrying themselves for a long time. They have been holding their own life together. They have been managing. They have been pushing. They have been staying ready. So the guilt isn't just annoying. It's sad in a specific way. It's the sign of someone who didn't get to be human without earning it. Someone who learned that simply being is not enough. Someone who learned that comfort must be justified. Someone who learned that needs are dangerous. And when that's seen clearly, compassion begins to appear. Not soft, not sentimental, accurate. The kind of compassion that says, of course you feel guilty, look at what you learned. Not stop feeling guilty, not be kinder to yourself, just this makes sense. And that this makes sense is often the first real rest, because the system relaxes when it feels understood, not when it's scolded, not when it's pushed, understood. A lot of people think they need permission from life to rest, but what they often need is permission from the old environment inside them, permission from the voice that still speaks in the accent of the past, permission from the part of them that still believes rest equals risk. And that permission doesn't always arrive as a confident statement. Sometimes it arrives as a small recognition. I'm exhausted, and I am allowed to be exhausted. I am allowed to recover. I don't need to prove that I'm tired. I don't need to justify my rest. Because here is the truth that guilt tries to hide. Rest is not a reward. Rest is maintenance. Rest is how the mind returns to itself. Rest is how the body repairs what effort breaks down. Rest is not weakness. Rest is not laziness. Rest is not failure. Rest is the part of life that makes the rest of life possible. And when you begin to hold that truth, not as an inspirational quote, but as an inner stance, things change subtly. You start to notice how guilt shows up like clockwork. You start to notice its favorite lines. You're wasting time. You should be doing something. You're falling behind. You don't deserve this. And instead of believing it completely, you start to see it as a pattern. And once it becomes a pattern, it becomes less personal. Less like, this is who I am. More like, this is what I learned. That distinction matters because it removes shame. And when shame reduces, rest becomes possible. Not perfect rest, not instant peace, but a more honest rest. The kind where you can sit down and still feel a little guilt, but you don't let guilt drive the entire moment. The kind where your body can begin to recover even if your mind is still learning. And over time, something else happens. You begin to discover what you actually feel when you're not running. Sometimes it's relief, sometimes it's sadness. Sometimes it's anger that you've been holding in your shoulders for years. Sometimes it's emptiness. Sometimes a strange quiet. And many people avoid rest because they sense that something emotional is waiting underneath. They sense that if they stop, they will feel something they haven't had time to feel. So they stay busy, they stay useful, they stay moving. Not because they love being busy, because being still means meeting themselves. And meeting yourself is intimate, it's exposing, it's honest. Which is why guilt appears. It tries to pull you back out of that meeting. It says, do something, because doing is safer than feeling for a lot of people. But if you've been exhausted for a long time, feeling might not be the enemy. Feeling might be the beginning of being real again. And being real is often what brings energy back. Not fake energy, not adrenaline. Real energy, the kind that comes from not abandoning yourself all day. Because guilt for resting is often the last chain in a long pattern of self-abandonment. You abandon your body's signals. You abandon your need for pause. You abandon your own pace. And then you wonder why you feel empty. You wonder why you feel distant from yourself. You wonder why nothing restores you. It's because restoration requires presence. It requires you to be with yourself long enough for your system to settle. And guilt interrupts that settling. It keeps you in motion. So if there is a next after this video, it isn't a technique. It's a noticing. The next time you sit down and guilt rises, you notice the exact moment it appears, the exact line it uses, the exact pressure it creates. You notice what it tries to make you do. Get up, prove, justify, earn. And you simply recognize this is the old rule. Not to fight it, not to win, just to see it. Because when you see something clearly, it loosens. Not because you forced it, because it can't hide inside you anymore as truth. It becomes what it is, a learned signal, a survival reflex, a habit of worth. And worth is not something you produce. Worth is what you are. The most reliable sign that you're healing isn't that you never feel guilty again. It's that you start recovering faster from guilt. You stop taking it so seriously. You stop building your life around it. You stop letting it decide your pace. You still hear it, but it no longer owns you. And when that begins, rest starts to feel less like a crime and more like a return. A return to your body, a return to your rhythm, a return to the part of you that existed before you learned you had to earn being human. This isn't about becoming a different person. It's about becoming less supervised inside yourself, less monitored, less judged, more honest, more inhabited. And if any part of this felt familiar, you don't have to turn it into a project. You don't have to force a change tonight. You can just notice where guilt shows up most for you. Is it when you lie down? Is it when you sleep in? Is it when you say no? Is it when you take a break? Is it when you do nothing and the world doesn't collapse? If you want to, you can leave one sentence in the comments. Just one. Not a full story. Not an explanation. Just a place where guilt finds you. Because when people name these patterns out loud, something shifts. It stops being private shame and becomes shared human reality. And even if you say nothing, the awareness will still continue. It will show up later, quietly, when you sit down and feel the old pressure rise. And you will recognize it. Not as proof you're failing, as proof your system is learning a new definition of safety. A definition that includes rest. A definition that includes being human without earning it. Whenever you're ready to keep observing, you know where to find this space.